everyone. Welcome to the Dancing Bear Enlightenment Academy podcast, Holistic Transformation. Today, we have a very special guest, ZofiaRenneaMorales. She is a biophysicist, corporate exec, investor, healer, hypnotist. Her path through life has been the scenic route. She overcame challenges, abusive marriage, chronic pain, infertility, Lyme disease. Wow, that's a lot. To become a safe space for clients to grow. That's an interesting combination of things. Welcome, Zofia.
Thank you. I believe in having all the freaking t-shirts, apparently.
So many different jobs, so little time.
Exactly. So many people to connect with on so many layers.
Wow, that's quite interesting. So tell us how you went from being a physicist to an executive to becoming a healer and hypnotist. That's quite a journey.
It is quite a journey, and it was all logical steps up to a certain point when it stopped being logical, and that was the moment that my soul had to use the spiritual 2x4 up the head. Because I was raised to be very logical and, going through science, it's got to be replicatable. Don't give me this anecdotal evidence stuff. You need the right size study group and all of this in order to say that you have found something that really means something. And I lived my life that way, even after I left science, which I did fairly early on in my career, and went into finance, banking. I went into the technical side of banking in that I ran computer data centers. And so lots of very highly logical stuff going on around me, very organized, and stress like through the roof.
Yeah.
But I made the step from science into finance because one of the things that I learned as I went through my advanced education, after you study enough science history, you may notice this pattern that I also noticed, which is people have a tendency to die of what they study. And it comes back to a foundational problem that we have with research, which is there's a certain pragmatism that goes on. It's like every form of protection that you add for yourself further complicates and makes an experiment more expensive. And so we use the minimum amount of protection for ourselves that we know we need to have. But we're studying something we don't fully understand. And so while you may believe you're taking an adequate amount of protection, there is likely an aspect of this thing that you're studying that you have not protected yourself against. And that's where the trouble arises.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
And so I decided I wanted kids with the right numbers of fingers and toes, and I didn't want to check out early. So I said, all right, I think I'm going to go into something else. What do I know? And what I knew at that time was computers, because back in the day, any complicated scientific machine you were running was attached to a computer, and you probably had to write the program to run the machine.
Yeah.
And so that was the saleable skill that I took out of that. And so I went into data centers, as mentioned, in the financial sector. And it was the scientific studies actually served me better than I anticipated. You wouldn't think there's a lot that translates there, right? But the fact that in science, when you're doing basic research, you have to learn to troubleshoot to make sure that you're arriving at a correct conclusion when an experiment fails to yield the result you're expecting. And so you get really good at, okay, troubleshooting. Is it really that the experiment is not working, or do we need to change some of the conditions? Is that what's keeping it from not working the way that I believe it ought to? And so you get really good at finding the actual root of the reason that something has gone wrong or blown up. And so that works out really well in corporate. And in fact, they reward you handsomely when you make problems go away. And so I did quite well in corporate in terms of the measures that the mundane world typically uses. I was promoted, I got raises and bonuses and new responsibilities and all the things, and set land speed records in doing that in the organization I was in, but it was really hard on me, me personally, physically, uh, because yeah, they don't have a lot of boundaries. When you're really good at what you do and you fix problems, by the time you've gotten the thing that they've thrown you at most recently, and it kept getting bigger. It's like, oh, well, you did really well with that application. Now we're going to give you a couple of systems, and now we're going to give you a subsection of the data center, and now we're just going to give you the whole freaking data center. And so every time they move you to the next thing, you're starting over. And I sort of performed in, it was self-defense. I want to sleep through the night, so I'm going to fix the stuff so I don't get called during the night. Um, and it was very hard on me personally, and it was hard on my health. I had health stuff going on at that point that I didn't recognize was going on. Um, and by the time I left that phase of my career, I was almost an adrenaline junkie in some ways, because I separated from them, and then I had this time where I was between gigs, and I was literally twitchy because when I left, I had two phones that sat on my desk, and I had a cell phone with one of those ginormous extra large batteries attached to it, and a backup battery that I could switch out. And I would be on all three at the same time some days, juggling and coordinating problems and this kind of thing. And so when I left and no one was calling and it was quiet, I didn't know what to do with myself, because I'd gotten to the point I was used to this level of unrelenting stress, and you need to be on point. So that's kind of where I ended in the in the corporate world. And I decided after that position, the data center stuff, that I wanted to be more customer facing. And so I started to move more into the world of mortgage and financial education. Ultimately, I ended up in what they call Community Reinvestment Act work, CRA work. And what the Community Reinvestment Act is the legislation that tells banks that they have to provide services for everyone, not just for the rich people. And so to incentivize banks, they get points for doing certain things. And so I was in charge of making sure we were doing the right things. We were showing up at community fairs. We're showing people how to budget. We're showing people how to improve their credit on their own. You don't have to pay people a bunch of money to do it. This kind of education was my bent. And that was the big thing that I took out of that first position in the data center, was this addiction to helping. I
How,
haven't
how did you
was
end up as a hypnotherapist and a healer? How did that happen?
that's a larger turn, right? Because so far everything that I've been doing, I've been able to do completely logically rational minded kind of stuff. And I started getting invitations into what I want to say, the edges more, the less explored, the less substantiated stuff. And I would kind of look at it and go, that's nice, and walk on by. And your soul will try to encourage your attention at first. And then when you don't pay attention, it will up the ante, right?
Oh.
And so I've had this health thing going on, and it started to get much, much, much worse. And I'm one of these people, I'm willing to throw money at a problem. And so I was throwing money at it, and I was going to specialists and trying this and trying that, trying the other. And we still hadn't gotten to the answer of what was going on with me. And my soul finally decided I was not going to be able to throw money at this problem anymore. And there was this convergence of events by which I got so sick that I could no longer work. Your soul will take away your favorite toys if you are being overly distracted by them. And my favorite toy was my big S brain. And I started literally losing brain function.
Mm.
I started losing words. I couldn't find the words that I needed. I started losing entire chunks of memory of what went on earlier in the day. And I got to this point where I would go into the kitchen to make dinner. Nice, simple 30-minute meal, a salad and a steak, easy peasy kind of stuff. It would take me 3 hours because I couldn't remember what I was doing from moment to moment. And I was having to refigure, why am I in the refrigerator? What did I come in here for? Oh yeah, it's dinner time. What am I making for dinner? Oh yeah, I was just gonna put together a salad and some steak. And so I'd start to get things out and I would go to the sink and I couldn't remember. I didn't bring the vegetables with me. I was a mess. It was really, really bad. And so I wasn't working. And my husband's industry had started to shift, and his jobs were getting shorter and the time between jobs were getting longer because of the shift in his industry. And so at this point, we had moved across the country to take a job that was supposed to be a 3 to 5 year gig. Okay. So we cleaned out the savings accounts and did what we had to do to get there to take that job. And 12 months later, they finally came clean with him and let him know that, yes, the $40 million that they started this project with was actually mostly gone when they hired him to come in and salvage this thing. And there wasn't the money really to save it. And I'm not entirely sure even why they hired him. It's like, you've got enough to pay the man, but not enough to allow him to do his job, really. So after a year, that was gone. And so were our savings because we hadn't had a chance to build that cushion back up because I wasn't working. In fact, I was quite sick, and that's taking a lot more money. And so we're in this place now that it's like, we don't have a lot of options. I don't care how financially savvy you are. If your income is goose eggs, you can't budget zero. You just can't. And God love him, my husband, is one of these guys. He's immediately out there looking for the next thing. But we already know, with the state of his industry and his current qualifications, that this is not going to be a couple of week kind of thing. This is going to be months in the making. And so we had several hard conversations and came to a few of what I would describe as, on the surface, mutually exclusive conclusions. And the first one was that he needed more education, a different degree, in order to shift his career in a way that would allow him to go after jobs that would last longer, that weren't in this same section of industry. And he needed an MD, a Juris Doctor, or an MBA. And so I left him chewing on that decision. And the other decision that we came to was we had to declare bankruptcy. There was no alternative to that. And it's not something I ever wanted to do. In my own mind, I thought of it as committing bankruptcy, which tells you how inclined I was to go down that road.
So we're still not to the hypnotherapist. So
We are way not to the hypnotherapist.
so maybe we can fast forward a little bit.
We can fast forward a little bit. So my soul took away my favorite toy. It took away my money. And it sent us through a series of like impossible situations.
Mhm.
Okay. And I think it sent us through the impossible situations as part of a trust building exercise for me, to show me that there are possibilities that are illogical. You can declare bankruptcy and send your husband back to grad school at the same time. And so eventually, as this all spins out, we end up in a borrowed condo back in a place we'd lived previously. And he's working at a third of his normal salary. We're in the bankruptcy. And I finally got a diagnosis of Lyme disease,
Yeah.
chronic, long term, eating your brain now, Lyme disease. And I was so happy to get that diagnosis finally because I'd been to all the specialists and we'd ruled out a list as long as my arm of other things that it could have been. And the guy that diagnosed it said, I have this protocol that has a 70% success rate. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. And he's like, I'll send it with you so you can, plan and budget accordingly and, see what your insurance will do. And I ran the calculator on the numbers, assuming the insurance wasn't going to weigh in. And my brain wasn't doing too good, so I never got to the same number twice, but it was all in the neighborhood of $27,000 to $28,000 for the first year. It's like, yeah, I definitely need insurance to weigh in on this. And so I called insurance, and the lady on the phone, her first words out of her mouth after I told her the diagnosis was, "We don't believe in chronic Lyme." Isn't that freaking convenient for you guys?
I've had so many patients with chronic Lyme that I've treated. That's
I
not
know it seems like
it.
it's like this insane denial of reality, right? But the
Well, they just
insurance
don't want to pay.
companies are
Yeah.
always the last people to accept that a thing is a thing, right?
They're in the business of accepting your money, not paying for
Well,
what.
yeah, exactly. And you have to practically hold their feet to the fire to get them to pay
Yeah.
for anything. And so I also got a lesson in that moment about ask the questions that you want answered, because in my mind, I thought to myself, well, can it get any worse? And the answer is yes. And I got the answer immediately because I said, okay, so you're paying for 60 days of oral antibiotics and the doctor's visits, right? And she says, oh, yes, you need to know your doctor is no longer in network.
Oh, wow.
Oh, isn't that just what it needed, right? So that was a lesson in don't ask the questions you don't want answered, ask the questions you do want answered.
Yeah.
And so after I got off the phone, I said, well, what am I going to do? Because it's eating my brain. It's not like I can wait 3 years for the bankruptcy to be done.
Yeah.
It's something that we have to do now. And so I called my father because that's all I could think of, despite the fact that I was raised by a German and a Norwegian who were very clear with me that when you turn 18, you are on your own and responsible for your own stuff. Don't expect to live in the basement or come home at some point, because that's not how this game is played. But I figured this might be the one moment where perhaps there would be an exception made. I mean, we're in bankruptcy. It's eating my brain. I'm going to die if I don't do something about this. And the bank of Dad was empty. And that night, I went to bed with my husband. And I wasn't sleeping because that's the stage of Lyme I was at. They'd started me on drugs, and so you get sicker when you start killing it because it's more toxic when you kill it
Yeah.
off than when it's alive.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going through normal sleep cycles at this point. And I've discovered if I meditate, I feel a little better in the morning, despite the fact that I'm not actually sleeping the way I should be sleeping. And that night there was no meditating. My brain was like this trapped squirrel, and it's going down all of these dead ends. Well, maybe we can get a loan. We're in bankruptcy. Well, maybe I can get a job. You can't make me dinner in 30 minutes. Well, maybe my husband can, well, he's already working full time and going back to school full time. My husband is not sleeping, as it is. And so there's all these dead ends, and I'm not finding the answer. And about 3 in the morning, I, for lack of a better word, just gave up. It wasn't even as graceful and poetic as surrender. It was this acceptance that I do not have the answer, full stop. And I decided there was really only one other thing to try that I had not tried, and that was to talk to God. Had not talked to God in decades because I was raised in what I would consider religious abuse. It was a really messed up fundamentalist religion, and I couldn't square the God I was being taught about with the God that sat inside of me. And it took me a long time to pick the religion apart from God and recognize they were not the same thing.
Not the same.
not the same at all. And in that moment, I decided I was going to talk to the God that I knew and understood inside of me, not the one that I had been taught about as a kid. And I said, God, I will do anything to get better. And I meant it with every fiber of my being. And I immediately got my answer in the form of a little tiny voice that said, really, anything? The voice had a point. Anything is a really big
Really big
commitment.
word. Yeah.
There aren't any edges on anything. And so I thought about my edges very seriously. And my edges are, we're here to help each other and love each other. And so I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to steal from you. And I'm certainly not going to become an axe murderer. Those are my edges.
Yeah.
And I thought very carefully about the God that I knew and understood inside of me. Okay, because the God I was raised with would ask you to do some of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the God that I knew inside of me would never ask me to hurt somebody else or to lie or to steal or any of that. And so, to be very clear, I said, God, for you, I will do anything. And I got my first miracle because I fell asleep. And I got my next miracle in the morning. I woke with clarity that I had to go get one of these clearing IVs that the doctor offered. $250 that I had no idea where it was ever coming from, but I knew that that's what the next thing was. And while I was in the infusion room getting that IV that day, the doctor actually walked through, which he doesn't go in there. That's the nurse's area. And so I waved him over, explained that I'm a cash pay client, we're in bankruptcy, and what are my options here because the insurance is out of the picture. And he smiled when I told him insurance was out of the picture. I'm like, really? This is good news. Okay. Explain. He says, now you have all the options. It hadn't occurred to me at that point that insurance is actually handcuffs in a lot of ways.
Oh, yeah.
They make the choice of how you're treated more than your doctor does nowadays.
Yes, they tell the doctor what to do.
Which is, I think, the tail wagging the dog.
What do we call it? It's medical fascism.
Yes, there you go. I like it. So I said, do tell, what are my options? And he says, well, we have a naturopath herbalist who's on staff. He's not covered by insurance, but he has amazing success with parasitic diseases. And that's what Lyme is. It's a parasitic disease. And his office visits are half the price of mine. And instead of these fancy IVs and exotic antibiotics, he uses bottles of herbs that are like $30 to $40.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't do IVs at all to treat Lyme disease.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly.
Homeopathy and a couple of herbs.
Exactly.
And nutrition. Nutrition's important.
And nutrition, exactly. And if he'd have talked to me about this guy even a week earlier, I'd have been like, oh, no.
In some states, they're not allowed to.
Well, in some states, you're not allowed to do it at all. Yeah. You can in Indiana, which is where I was. And so since it was the only option, the scientist went, all right, fine, herbs it is. And usually at this point in the story is when I forget to tell you that going to the herbalist, I was cured of my Lyme disease in 3 months instead of 2 years.
2 years.
And for a fraction of the cost. So that turned out to be a beautiful place to be sent. But the turn that happened when I was sent over there was I ran into a book in his waiting room that said the emotion code. Now, I mentioned I was raised by a German and a Norwegian earlier. And so what I was taught about emotions growing up was you don't have them. Or if you have them, you push them way down and pretend you don't have them.
Yeah, you hide them.
you hide them, and you're allowed to be, a little bit grateful or happy from time to time, but not too much because you might make someone else feel bad, right? And so none of that is really a useful way to live as a human being.
No, it's not.
It's terrible, and I'd spent years in talk therapy trying to, what I want to say, take the heat out of some of the stuff that was smashed down in there and turning stinky. And I won't say that it was not helpful, but it was not helpful enough. And so when I saw this book and this guy claims he has the emotion code, I want to know because I haven't figured it out yet and I've gone to professionals. And so I started reading this book, and he uses muscle testing. And the scientist was okay with muscle testing because scientists are okay with black boxes. And what a black box process is, for those of you listening, it's a process we can't describe what's inside of that box, but we do know that if you put in A, you always get out B. And it's predictable, it's replicatable, and so that makes it okay to me as a scientist. So muscle testing worked for me because I could prove that it gets me to truth. And so I was good with that. Scientist is happy. And so I'm muscle testing my way through this book, and I'm clearing out emotions, and it's helping. And so I'm like, okay, this is pretty cool. And then he had this section on heart walls. And I know for a
Oh,
fact, heart walls,
heart wells,
walls,
heart walls. Okay,
heart
yeah.
walls, yes. And I knew for a fact I have one of those because I make a conscious decision whether I let you behind mine. And he made a pretty good argument for taking it down. And so, being the type A project manager that I am, I set about doing that in a very methodical fashion. And as I started taking down my heart wall, weird shit started happening. No other description for that was appropriate in that moment. I was starting to see fairies. I was seeing crossed over dead people. I was knowing things about the past and the future that I had no uh, scientific, logical way to explain. I spontaneously said a prayer in Hebrew out of nowhere. Never studied Hebrew. And the scientist is really scrambling to try and explain all of this. It's like, you have more brain damage than you realize. Your imagination is exceedingly creative. Well, you did attend a Seder once when you were in college. You must have remembered the prayer from that. Uh-huh. So I'm like really reaching for explanations on what this is, but I'm not accepting that it has any kind of explanation that those of us in the spiritual world would assign to it. And your team will be very persistent with you when you're actively ignoring things. And so I suspect they sat down and said, okay, Miss Science, you need the proof in a pile of documentation. We'll give it to you. Because I came home from the grocery store one afternoon, and my neighbor is staggering under her husband's weight trying to help him into the house. They're both in their middle 80s. He's twice the size that she is, and he's clearly in a lot of pain. So the ice cream can melt. I go over and help her get him in the house, and she's explaining his kidney situation has gotten so bad recently, and she's really worried for him, and that's what all the pain's about. She's going to get an emergency appointment with the kidney doctor. I'm like, well, you go do that. I'll stay here with him, and keep him company. There's not much I can do for him, right? It's not like sitting down or something is going to alleviate the pain, but human contact, we're holding hands. And I know him to be a very devout person. He was a minister much of his life. He and his wife have a very active and engaged relationship with God. And they're what I would describe as the best kind of Christians because they act from their faith and they treat everyone wonderfully, regardless of what your particular belief or lack of belief is. And they don't force their stuff on you. And so that's what I would describe as the best kind of Christians. And he closed his eyes, and I can see that his lips are moving, and I feel really awkward just kind of visually eavesdropping on him having this moment. So I closed my eyes to give him some privacy. And in my mind's eye, there's this little tiny flame that I see. And it's kind of bouncing and dancing like a pilot light that's on the edge of going out. And I was given this understanding that that's where his life force is right now. He's on the edge of being out of here. Now I'm quite confident the scientists did not ask this question. I'm not sure where this question came from, but the question that I asked was, can we do something about that? And the instant I finished that thought, that flame came into like this roaring bonfire. I don't know how big it got because he dropped my hands. And so my eyes whipped open. I'm like, what? What's going on? Right. And he says, are you a healer? And I'm looking around to see who he's talking to because none of that faith healing stuff happening over here. this is very not scientific. And I was saved from having to answer by his wife coming back and saying they had the appointment, but they had to leave right now. So we hustle him out to the car, and I hid in my house for 2 days while the scientist proceeded to convince me that nothing had happened. And I was an absolutely terrible neighbor because I'm a good Midwestern girl, and you help your neighbors when they're in distress. You shovel their walk, you bring them soup, you do things to assist them when they're in these kinds of situations. So after 2 days, I decided I better go next door and help her plan a funeral. I don't know. We'll figure it out. And I got over there, and she opened the door with a smile on her face. Okay, so it's not going to be funeral plans. And she's, oh, come on in. Jay has so many questions for you. And my stomach dropped through the bottom of my feet because I got no answers. I've convinced myself that nothing happened, nothing. And I'm committed. I'm already there. So I have to go in. And I went in, and there's Jay. He's in the living room. He's kicked back in his Barca lounger. He's got his drink and his remote and his book, and he's looking fat and happy. How you doing, Jay? He says, I'm feeling great. You know, it was the weirdest thing. By the time I got to the doctor's office, I was feeling pretty good. And they ran me through the entire battery of tests that they normally run me through. And my kidney function came back normal. And the scientist had to sit down and shut the fuck up. Because you talk to a conventional doctor and they will tell you there is one direction kidney disease goes.
Yeah, it's hard to repair them.
It's very hard.
So then after
And
that, you decided to become a healer and a coach?
well, yeah, after that, I decided I needed to take another look at everything that had gone previously and look at it through a different lens. And so I've been on a path of now acquiring, what I want to say, modalities, tools in my toolbox, because I am still a troubleshooter at heart. And there are no bad tools out there. It's just the wrong tool for the job. So I guess my message around modalities is, well, I tried EFT and it didn't do anything for me. It's like, yeah, you probably used it on something that it wasn't going to respond to. It doesn't mean there's a problem with EFT. It just means it wasn't the tool for that moment.
Well, there's a saying that I like to use: if your only tool is a hammer, every problem's a nail.
Yeah.
You know,
And not every problem is a nail.
no, you don't
And
treat kidney disease the same way you treat Lyme disease.
no, you certainly don't. Yes,
Yeah,
you
and
certainly don't. So that's how I went from extreme rational left brain scientist to, well, I went totally woo for quite a long time, but now I'm kind of swinging back more to the middle where it's like, yeah, I do both. It is what it is.
yeah. So how do you work with people? What can they expect if they work with you?
What they can expect if they work with me is I look at the entire picture. I'm about as holistic gets. my intake form takes like 2 hours to fill out because I
Gotcha.
see patterns. And so it's like, tell me everything. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about your father. Tell me, how these things are showing up in your life, because I see the patterns. And then I pull your soul contract and I pull your human design, and we look at how you're engaging with the world. And then we listen to what your soul wants to have happen next, and it will speak to you through your body. And
Nice.
so I interpret what it's saying, and we go through it step by step, hand in hand.
And you work with people online?
I work almost exclusively online. I can count the number of people who've been in my office on one hand. So I have clients all over the world. It's all handled over Zoom, and that's the beautiful thing about energy work, is there's no distance barrier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So I understand you have a free gift for our audience. It's a quiz. What is your number one spiritual superpower? Tell us about the quiz.
Yes. Well, I created that because I've sat in a lot of psychic development circles since the waking up process. And since I realized that all of this stuff I'd been writing off was clairvoyance and claircognizance and
Yeah.
channeling. And so,
I,
yeah, I figured I needed to learn a few things about these things. But the number one most common thing that I notice when you're sitting in a development circle like this is the person who sees envies the person who knows, who envies the person who hears. And we all come with gifts that are specific to us and our overall mission. And one of the most helpful things that I do in development circles now, the ones that I coordinate, is we have a round robin where you tell the person next to you what you admire about them so they can see what their giftedness is and have some acknowledgement of that, so they can lean into that because that's their strength. But they don't recognize it as a strength because that's just me. That's just how I am. And so that's why I created the superpower quiz, to give you some insight into your particular giftedness and what that giftedness is useful for. Because a lot of times, especially from space holders, they're like, a space holder, what? It
yeah.
seems like such a nothing thing. It's like, oh, that's because it's commonplace for you to see people go through profound changes in your presence. That's not common. People don't just change like that unless they're in a space that will allow them to do it. And that's your giftedness right there. It's a beingness giftedness that you have. And so I created this quiz to introduce you to you, because I can see the outside of your bottle and I know how it works. I can introduce you to that. And so that's why I created the quiz.
Nice. So for those of you on YouTube, I'll have the link below, but the link is superpowerquiz.us. So those of you on the podcast, you can just log in later to superpowerquiz.us
Yep.
and get that wonderful quiz. That sounds really awesome. So do you have any closing remarks for our audience today?
Ah, yes, I do have closing remarks for your audience. Transformation. If you're going through something right now, and I suspect being attracted to a transformation podcast, you are, first, know that it's not forever. This is a stage you're going through. It does get better, it does get easier, and there is a point at which you stop feeling like you're being melted down and back together in some strange new shape that you don't recognize. And it's amazing on the other side. So be patient with it. Try to lean into it. And I know it sucks at times, but try and love it anyway. And there are those of us who've been through, and you can always reach out.
Very good. Well, thank you for being our guest today.
Yes,
And
thank you
thank
for
you, everyone.
having me.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And remember to be the light you want to see in the world.